Well, somebody's still flying somewhere, going from north to south. Had a red tail on it, so it might even be Qantas, eh? Those things burn kerosene at a rate of thousands of pounds per hour, thousands of kilograms per hour, tons per hour. And every pound or every kilogram or every ton of kerosene going into a fireplace, whether it's a stationary fireplace or it's a jet engine, kerosene lamp if you like, it emerges as 2.68 pounds or kilograms or tonnes of carbon dioxide. Atmospheric fossil carbon emissions, they call it. And the International Airline Transport Association and a couple of other, you might as well call them trade unions or syndicates for airlines, they're currently lobbying the United Nations, the European Union, the World Health Organization, to take leave of their senses and consent to exempting the airline industry from all provisions designed to achieve zero net fossil carbon emissions to the atmosphere by 2050. And they're doing that because apparently they've come to the conclusion, reasonably so, that if you go talking about zero net fossil fuel emissions, then you can't actually have an aeroplane much bigger than, if you assume that batteries are going to become 100 or 200% better than they are at the moment, you might get a 4 or a 6 seat aeroplane that's capable of flying for half an hour to an hour at about 100 miles an hour. Yes, they've flown a solar powered electric aeroplane all the way around the world, but it took about 2 years to do it, very, very slowly, and it had the wingspan of a jumbo jet kind of thing, and it had lots and lots and lots of motors and lots and lots and lots of propellers, all slowly at the maximum possible aerodynamic efficiency. There is, as far as I'm aware, one VH, that's Australian, registered general aviation aircraft that has an electric engine with batteries. And each battery gives you 15 minutes. And I think that would be perhaps 7 to 10 minutes at full thrust. But if you take off and then climb at 3/4 power and then cruise at half power and then use 30% or less while descending for land, then you can get 15 minutes out of each battery. It's operated out of an airport over near Perth. And the idea is it's such a unicorn of a thing that people will go all the way over there and they'll pay to go for a fly around the paddock in an electric 2-seat aeroplane. You're not going to get to fly between state capital cities in something like that. You're not going to replace anything that has been operating for the past 50 years as an airliner, because refined transport fuel is so energy dense. It's got a lot of power in a little bit of weight and a little bit of space. People talk about moving to green hydrogen. Well, hydrogen's got a couple of problems. One of them is that you either have to refrigerate it to cryogenic temperatures, which means great big insulated tanks and a refrigeration unit, which is kind of difficult to fit into an aeroplane. Or you have to have really, really strong containers and hold it at really high pressures to get enough of it in there, because hydrogen's, it's lovely, except for its density. The other thing is hydrogen is the smallest bloody molecule in the universe, and that means unless you freeze it, back to the cryogenics, and even then, it will infiltrate into any material of any container you try to hold it in. And that embrittles all of the metal. So eventually, if you keep hydrogen in a steel cylinder, it turns into something that's not as strong as cast iron and falls to pieces. And it turns out that if you apply the principle of harvest everythingism to a forest and you cut down the forest so that you can plant a single artificially selected species like palm oil so that you can make a high energy oil and refine that into something that you can mix 50-50 with fossil fuel and burn it in a jet engine. Well, the ecology crashes wherever it is that you bulldoze the existing forest, where the more life occupies a space, the more life can occupy a space. Therefore, eventually the topsoil rises up to cover over the rocks and the biomass and the biodiversity increases unless somebody comes along and tries to harvest everything. It's how the broadacre agro cult of harvest everything ism has created every man-made desert on earth. Which is an interesting point to ponder, because there's a bloody lot of them. There is a bloody lot of them. The first one kicked off about 11,500 years ago surrounding Göbekli Tepe, where the cult of harvest everythingism began. But anyway, back to my point, even using palm oil blended with kerosene, you still don't get net zero fossil carbon emissions to the atmosphere in your airliner. So, as they have been doing since I was a teenager, the airline industry is applying for an exemption to the convention that people should have to pay government tax on refined transport fuel. When I buy fuel to put in my car or my lawnmower or my chainsaw, I pay government tax on the fuel. Might be 35%, perhaps, I don't know. It's not an actual tax on carbon as such, so to speak. It doesn't apply to renewables like firewood, like you don't pay a lot of fuel levy on the chainsaw fuel that you use to cut down the firewood. You pay the fuel levy on the car fuel that you use to drag the firewood from the forest back to your fireplace. But if you're buying aviation fuel, no, you don't pay fuel levy on the aviation fuel, just like there's an off-road diesel rebate. So if you're a registered primary producer and you've got a business number with a taxation department, every litre or drum or truckload of diesel that you burn, you get money deducted from its price because the oil company doesn't charge you the state or federal diesel tax. Similarly, the airlines don't pay tax on aviation gas. Whether it's AvTOR or Avgas, it's tax-free. Funny that. But it's not going to ever get back to what things used to be considered normal, is it? We've got enough unvaccinated people around the world, and I'm one of them because my government has somehow managed to make a mess of the vaccination. Probably complacency because we've managed to keep COVID out of Australia, and the variants that were coming in weren't horribly, terribly contagious, so therefore our half-assed hotel-based quarantine, where you take all of the hotels that were otherwise going to be empty because there's been a complete cessation in international tourism, and the government cooks the system so that everybody who's going into COVID quarantine goes into those hotels. The fact that the hotels are basically vertical human breeder reactors for COVID because the air conditioning was not designed for barrier nursing and infection control. But the other thing is that they're smack in the middle of the cities because that's where the tourists wanted to buy a hotel bed or rent a hotel bed. So every time you do get a breach in quarantine, it goes straight out into the city. And in Sydney, the way everything went belly up was there was a limousine driver, because the state government was using private hire cars to transport international airline crews from the airport to their quarantine hotel. And the people who were administering the contract to the private hire car companies, they somehow got it into their Fox and Sky News twisted little minds that if they required the limousine drivers and the hire car drivers to actually wear a fucking mask and or gloves and or maintain social distancing, then they wouldn't get anybody bidding for the contract. So just like they didn't require them to be vaccinated. So it was an unvaccinated limousine driver who wasn't wearing a mask who brought Delta variant into Bondi, and it spreads really quick. And a whole bunch of people didn't want to have another lockdown, so they delayed until they were getting, I don't know, nearly 20 cases a day before they decided to actually have a lockdown. And by then, well, I think they cracked 100 cases yesterday, and they were up above 100 again today. Now the rest of Australia considers all of New South Wales to be a red zone. I think you're going to find there will be a new variant of COVID every 2 or 3 or 5 months, and that's because we're putting pressure on the virus, but not enough pressure to actually extinguish it. I mean, if you really wanted to extinguish COVID, then you would decide that everybody locks down for a fortnight starting today, and they stay where they bloody well are. India tried a variation on that and was castigated for human rights issues. But viruses don't give a shit about human rights. Viruses respond to barrier nursing and infection control, but you have to actually implement the principles. And exemption from quarantine is not quarantine. Exemption from quarantine is quarantine failure. That's what it is. And we have set up a system where there are multiple exemptions to quarantine, and therefore we have multiple quarantine failures. Finally, belatedly, the government's decided they're going to build some quarantine hotels which are not vertical. They will be individual buildings on a large acreage outside of the city, so that only people who work there are anywhere near there. I'm sure there's somebody who's going to say that it's a concentration camp. Well, you know, the idea of concentrating certain people behind barbed wire and guarding them so that they didn't go and introduce contagion to the people, politically it goes back to the British in South Africa after the Boer War. So Australia's a post-colonial British imperial colony. I think we're probably entitled to use a modified principle of the good old English concentration camp, and we will concentrate anybody who comes into the country until they prove that they do not have a disease. And 14 days is probably not long enough. Let's go for 21 or ideally 28 days, because there are people who take that long before the disease reveals itself in them, either with a test or with a sign or a symptom. But what that means is that you can just forget about the bloody airlines ever coming back to being what it was, where there was universal, cheap airline travel all over the world, where, you know, telephone sanitisers from Melbourne could go on a clap-catching holiday to Bali every bloody year for their annual holiday to celebrate their team winning the football. Yuppies could go and break their legs sliding off mountains in Aspen, Colorado, and, you know, then come back and have everybody at work sign their cast and think they were clever people. 2.68 pounds of carbon dioxide to every pound of kerosene going in through the engine. The planet can't stand it. It's all got to stop. We could have done something voluntarily. Any time in my lifetime, we could have done something voluntarily, but sadly, most of the 8 billion have voted not to pay attention to the scientists, not to pay attention to the atmospheric chemists, not to pay attention to the atmospheric thermodynamicists, not to pay attention to the climate science, not to pay attention to the biologists or the ecologists. They've chosen to pay attention to the economists who say that capital and resources are infinitely transferable. And if you convert all of your forest into chainsaw factories and then you cut down the forest, well, you can just subdivide the forest and sell it to yuppies wanting to have a sea change. Leave it for 20 years and it'll have regrowth scrub on it and you can call it a tree change and charge them twice the price. And then you can take the money you make from having a chainsaw factory and chopping down a forest and you can go somewhere else and you can hire or lease or buy the right to chop down somebody else's forest somewhere else that their ancestors have left to them. And if you don't do that, well, you've got to sit at home in the country that you made a mess of and starve there. And that's not what the cult of the harvest everythingists have been prone to do. They've been much more prone to move out and take somebody else's land because their ancestors made a fucking deadly mess of their own. Well, now they've crashed every ecology all around the biosphere simultaneously, and the Gaia hypothesis is fighting back. And this bloody bat eater's lament virus, as an apocalyptic superbug is concerned, it's pretty subtle. It really is subtle. One of the reasons I don't believe it's been cooked up in a laboratory is that nobody who works in the laboratory fucking about with viruses is smart enough to come up with anything that's remotely as subtle as this thing. I don't know whether you saw a movie called 28 Days, where at the end of the movie the hero looks up and he sees one of them things and he realises that out there in the rest of the world it's all normal. Well, my guess is that probably not long after the grid fails in Northern and Western America, then the global economy will collapse and we won't be seeing any more of these things. And at the moment, the Norte-armed Americanos and the poor buggers in Canada too, they're about 20 years into a drought. It's the biggest, ugliest drought they've had for 1,200 years. They've got water for 2 or 3 weeks, and it's going to be 2 or 3 months before they can expect any runoff. And they're seeing 49 degrees Celsius, 53 degrees Celsius in friggin' Canada. Canada's hotter than Death Valley. All this has occurred because the circum-Arctic polar jet stream, which once upon a time used to run around parallel to the parallels of latitude, because of global warming, it has become unstable and it started producing sine curves. The sine curves used to once upon a time precess and move around the planet. Currently, the sine curve shapes of the circumpolar jet stream, they're not precessing, they're sort of hovering in one spot so that it's able, by pausing in one spot, to really cook the shit out of one spot, and it's cooking the shit out of North America. They've already had some of the most spectacular wildfires they've ever seen, and I think it's going to get worse for them. The flip side of that, of course, is that at the moment, there's no mystery as to why I have swamp wallabies hanging around this part of the forest, because this is all a montane swamp. So we're getting lots of rain. Wish I could send some of it over to you fellas in Norte Armed Americano, fill up the reservoirs for you, Millie K and Juan Brown of Millie K channel and Blanco Lirio channel. But there's no way that I can figure out how to do a rain dance at a distance for somebody in California or Oregon or Utah or anywhere over there, Montana. It's British Columbia. Yeah, you guys are going to have to do rain dances for yourselves. But basically, the extremes are all becoming more extreme. We've had a week of -2 or -4 degrees outside at night in the middle of winter. It used to be fairly normal to have -12 or -15. If you think about it, having your overnight minimums being 10 degrees Celsius higher than what used to be normal, that's ecologically terrifying. So yeah, one of these days, you're going to notice that you haven't heard any aeroplanes going overhead for a week, and then you won't ever hear of them ever again. And when that much of America loses its hydroelectricity and their grid falls over, how many computers that underpin the World Wide Web are capable of operating without North American grid power? Yeah. And if the computers go down and the web goes down, how many auto banks are going to be dispensing cash, and how many FPOS machines and point of sale wave your card at them machines, tap card machines, how many of them are going to be anything other than a bloody ornament? So, yeah, it could all cascade very bloody fast, as far as I can see. So, yeah, for what it's worth, that's pretty much a situation report from the Endangered Species Sanctuary atop the ridge in the regrowth forest, otherwise known as a bushfire fuel bomb. But not quite a death trap, because I'm pretty close to my front gate and I can always run away to my refuge area on the neighbouring sheep farm. If my $10,000 fire hose collection fails to keep the fire at bay, next time we get to be on the dry end of the rough pineapple. Warbles on a lot to YouTube. Ciao.